Well, today we are going to talk about one of my favorite Buicks of all time, and that is this 1971 Buick Centurion convertible. Now, the Centurion was a model that was introduced by Buick to replace the Wildcat after the 1970 model year. And you're going to see that the Centurion, and indeed the Buick design overall for 1971, really represented a distinct departure from the styling of the previous generation, the 1965 to 1970 full-size cars. And it's not really a subtle transition. It actually was a completely different design direction for Buick. Now, Centurions were produced only from 1971 through 1973, and Buick made about 110,000 of them across the coupe form as well as the convertible form. You could not get a Centurion in other body styles. Before that, the vehicle that was equivalently the Centurion of the Buick lineup was the Wildcat, as I mentioned. Its last year was 1970. But only about, I think, 23,000 Wildcats were sold. So probably why Buick decided that they wanted to introduce a new sporty model to the lineup. And then after the 1973 model year, the Centurion was replaced by the LeSabre Luxus. So Buick started going more in a luxury direction, probably because engine horsepower was starting to be reduced owing to emission standards. And Buick likely knew that the performance days, at least what had been Buick had been a very active participant in performance, particularly with the GSX and the Stage 1 engines. Well, that was going by the wayside as emission standards and insurance rates were becoming much more stringent and also more costly on the insurance side for people to own powerful cars. So other General Motors divisions like Pontiac also made this pivot more toward luxury from performance, knowing again that time was relatively limited on the performance front. Now, to describe how much of a distinctive shift the 71 Centurion was and the 71 Buicks were from the previous model generation, we're going to start with this picture of a 1970 Wildcat. And I've purposely picked this picture. No, not because the car is missing its distinctive grille emblem like almost all 1970 Buicks are, unless there's an aftermarket one in that blank space between the grilles. But because of how the light is reflecting on this particular car. Now, notice that the entire side of the car is a highlight, but there's this distinctive break between being a highlight on the body side and then a low light on the hood of the vehicle, and also that distinctive shoulder that runs the length of the car. See that little shoulder between the glass plane and the outer edge of the door on this Buick? And you can see how it's picking up that low light, and there's a shadow there just perfectly. The light source must be kind of off in the distance and relatively low, probably a late evening picture. But notice how the light, like I said, there's very distinctive highlights and lowlights on this car owing to that kind of crisp form that you see, that crease at the top of the fender, and how the surfaces transition, I won't necessarily say abruptly, but certainly more abruptly than what we are about to see. So remember this picture, and remember in particular the form of the fender relative to the hood and then also to the body side. And the other thing that I will just ask you to remember is that diving line that here is accentuated by the body side molding. And that was something that was a Buick trait for a number of years. The 1970 Buicks had these long moldings that accentuated that. But just remember that, because that's going to show up, but in a very different form on the 1971 Buick. Now let's go to the 1971 Centurion and notice how the top of the fender just transitions so smoothly, that very soft radius where it starts spilling over the body side. Of course, there is a crease on this car that runs around just above the headlamp, goes over the grille, and basically goes around a good fraction of the car, and you can see it running down the body side and diving down as it approaches the rear wheel as well. But the big thing about this is you don't have that peaked fender, and you don't have this kind of abrupt transition between the highlights and the lowlights on this car, because the surface development is such that there's a lot of these what designers would call low-frequency convex surfaces. And what I mean by that, well, convex surface is kind of like a barrel shape. If you cut a barrel in half down the middle, you have this convex surface that would be half the barrel. And you can see that kind of barrel body side on this Buick. But you have the low frequency surface, just means that it's something where there's not a lot of ins and outs. It's very smooth. The surface changes slowly. It takes a fair amount of, I'll say, real estate in order to change. And that's something that these 1971 Buicks just did so well. And even look at how the fender transitions into that hood bulge. It's just very subtle, very soft. That surface is picking up a beautiful highlight here. But the front end also has this gradual transition as the hood goes forward. Everything is very subtle and done, I'll say, over a large amount of real estate. Even that diving line that you saw on the previous 1970 Wildcat, here it has that same diving line. I love how the Buick designers, though, made it almost like a little cove as it went rearward, so it would pick up a shadow. Just a beautiful piece of surface development. And I don't know that a lot of people appreciate these 1971 cars for the surface development that they really had. I think they are quite beautiful. The other thing that I'll point out in this photo is notice that shoulder is gone from the 1970 Buick that kind of ran all along the door and then up over the around that area where the rear quarter glass was. You do have a shoulder here, but it's not purely horizontal. It's kind of got that convexity to it like the overall body side. So a significant change for Buick. And the Centurion, in addition to this, was a pretty dramatic change from the Buicks of yesteryear in its minimalist ornamentation. There's not even ventiports on this Buick that they had on other Buicks. So Buick was starting to go away from some of those historical design traits. Now, for the purposes of comparison, let's take a look at my 1971 Marquis and contrast it with the Centurion that you just saw. Notice the transition from the horizontal surfaces of the hood and the inner fender over to the body side are denoted by a clean, crisp edge that actually here is trimmed with some stainless moldings. But you're not going to get the light reflections that will just gradually transition on a car like this. This is a car where the light is going to break very distinctly at those creases. And of course, you have that shoulder that the 1970 Buick had, that also the Lincolns had, that's created by that inset glass plane on these Mercurys. Again, you're not going to have a smooth transition from that shoulder to the body side. So very different design philosophies, also a very upright front end as opposed to the Buick that had a more sloping nose. This car, the Mercury, conveys kind of elegance and stateliness, but does so in an upright and very formal, with an upright and formal posture. And the Buick kind of conveys luxury through its simplicity of surfacing, and just overall, I would say, lack of ornamentation, just very tasteful styling. Let's go back to the 71 Centurion convertible, and I'll point out a few other things on the front end. Notice that you don't have the Buick Tri-Shield logo on the car up front. You have a Centurion that has replaced it on the front of the hood, and very minimal chrome. If you got rid of those lamp monitors on the fenders and the Centurion badge, there's not a wind split molding. There's really nothing. And I think that helps the design because it just gives it this appearance of width. And you, of course, have the egg crate texture style grille. Relatively fine texture on this grille, too. Kind of in keeping with that minimalist philosophy of design. It's not this big, chunky textured, in-your-face grille. Just very tasteful, very elegant, and very different, frankly, from the Buick waterfall grills that you would see on many different Buicks over time. Now, as we transition to the side of the Centurion, it's a shame this car has the door edge guards and the body side molding. Designers generally hate those, and I never really minded them before, but now I'm really starting to loathe those things because they do hamper the overall design aesthetic, I think. But nonetheless, I will say this car does have the optional cornering lamps, so cornering lamp alert for those who like those. But notice that given where the light source is in this car and how the surfaces have been formed, There's not really a sharp break in the transitions from highlights to lowlights. This is a perfect picture just to show that. You notice that the highlights kind of subtly transition into the lowlights and into the shadows as you look at the car. And the light source must be behind the car because you notice the rear quarter panel is very bright. But it is showing off that diving kind of surface that the designers came up with. And I love how they kind of have this little cove underneath it to throw the shadow on the body side. So that diving line from the 1970 Buicks made it back here. It wasn't accentuated by a body side molding, and it was raised very significantly up on the car from being kind of at the mid-waist area so that I think designers could get that subtle convexity to the side. I think it looks fantastic. And as we transition to the rear of the car, you could see that kind of subtle barrel-like shape to the side exemplified by that quarter panel. Notice how it kind of tucks inward as it rolls upward. It reminds me a lot of the fuselage-style cars from Chrysler that came out in 1969. And I wouldn't be surprised if these cars were to some degree inspired by those fuselage cars because they have a number of similarities, including what I was talking about, that barrel-like section, although these are different. The fuselage cars, if you look at the body sides, they really don't have, especially the Chryslers, they don't have all that much to the body sides. It's just very clean, unbroken, no extra surfaces or creases or shoulders or anything. This Buick, as I mentioned, has that surface that's forming that diving line. You didn't really see that on the fuselage era Chryslers of the era, but you did have the significant tumble home and that convex body side. You can kind of see it here in the Buick. So maybe GM designers took some inspiration from Chrysler yet again after those fuselage era cars came out in 1969, kind of like the 1957 Chryslers would set the trend for GM's designs that would come out for the 1959 model year. I do love the scalloped kind of tail lamps, how they're recessed into the bumper and this little cove in between the deck lid and the bumper and the quarter panel. And the texture of the taillights does mimic the grille texture a little bit, if you notice that. You kind of have that ice cube tray, I'll say a more rectangular ice cube tray texture, very similar to what you saw on the front of the car. So the designers are trying to tie the front and the rear together. Of course, you have the deck lid with the ventilation louvers, the 1971 only General Motors ventilation louvers, where the engineers thought that it was better to have the flow-through ventilation come out through the deck lid. It seemed like a good idea in practice, but debris would fall in there and it would rot out. And in the wintertime, you go through a car wash and the water would freeze in there and freeze the trunk solid where it was trying to get out from the trunk. The water would flow in between the outer shell of the deck lid and the inner shell. And yes, people in the Midwest go through car washes all the time when the weather's below freezing because the car wash is heated on the inside and your car is just caked in road salt. So that was not a great invention and was only a one-year invention for General Motors cars in 1971. And now let's transition to the dead-on rear view. And I'm going to put in the inset the rear of a 1971 Oldsmobile 88 just to contrast this a little bit. There's some of the obvious differences between the Centurion and the Olds 88, most notably the tail lamps. Oldsmobile always had these kind of big blocky tail lights during this time frame, very functional style tail lights so that you could recognize an Oldsmobile from far away as opposed to the Buick's horizontal orientation. But if you notice, the creases on the Olds are just a little bit crisper and tauter everywhere, including that top of the rear quarter panel, very crisp edge on the Olds. The deck lid crease that runs cross-car is very crisp. The Buick, it almost looks like it's just a gentle convex surface that it's falling over the side. If you put like a marble on the deck lid, it would just kind of roll gently and then follow it off the edge, whereas the Olds, it would kind of abruptly turn as it got to the end of the car and fall off the car quite quickly. Both cars obviously have that kind of, I would say, fat midsection area and significant tumble home, but the Olds is just crisper in a number of different ways from the Buick that has softer surfacing. And Both good looking, but very different. Now, as we transition to the interior of the 1971 Centurion, unfortunately, this is a little bit of a letdown, I will say. While the overall interior theme isn't bad, it has that driver-centric style IP like all the other full-size GM cars except for the Chevrolets. Got in 1971. The interior materials and fit and finish just weren't all that great. The vinyls and the plastics were, I think, a definitive step down from what you could get in a Buick in the, let's say, mid-1960s or before. So, unfortunately, this is what buyers were faced. And for what was supposed to be the sporty Buick, the Centurion was really billed as the sporty Buick. It was on the short wheelbase, the 124-inch wheelbase, as opposed to the Electra's 127-inch wheelbase. So it shared the LeSabre wheelbase, but it came standard, at least in 1971, with the 455 cubic inch V8 underhood. So here you are, it's supposed to be a sporty Buick. It has, as we saw, kind of a lack of ornamentation. It's very restrained. Well, you got the exact same pretty much interior, at least from the IP and the carpet, etc. The seating was a little bit different, but you got pretty much the same interior as the Buicks of the era. I think it would have been nicer if they even had some gauges here. You can't really see it in this photo, but the IP just has a speedometer and a bunch of idiot lights. There's not an oil pressure gauge as an example, or a temperature gauge, or a tachometer. So you don't really have anything that's sporty to go along with the theme of the car, which is a bit unfortunate. And of course, the seating here, you can tell there's a high amount of lateral support with this bench seat, which I am clearly being sarcastic. That's about the flattest seat that you could get for the era. But very comfortable, very padded armrest. And this car's philosophy was to be sporty, but not over the top. If you wanted a car that had some muscle, and these did have some muscle. The 0 to 60 times on the Centurions were about 8.5 seconds with the standard 455, which really isn't that bad for a big full-size car. That was really moving for the time frame. So you did get some pep when you bought one. And that pep came from the Buick Division 455 cubic inch V8, the largest V8 the Buick Division would make. It was introduced for the 1970 model year. That would have been the only year that 455 was high compression. It was unfortunately lowered to be an engine that could run on low lead or no lead fuel for the 1971 model year. So the horsepower came down. It was 315 gross horsepower for 1971, but 510 pound-feet of torque. And that was more than any of the competitors. I don't think any competitor broke 500 pound-feet of torque, whether that was a GM division or Ford or Chrysler. So you did have kind of effortless torque to help you get moving in your vehicle, despite the fact that the horsepower wasn't the highest. I mean, the 71 Mercury Marquis that I showed you was rated 320 gross horsepower with the standard engine, which was a 429 cubic inch equipped with a 2-barrel carburetor. Optional 360 horsepower, 429 4-barrel carburetor in the Marquis. And other GM divisions were kind of similarly, had similar issues with the horsepower because they all had to run on low lead or no lead fuel. That was a GM corporate edict for 1971. So you lost a little bit of pep on the GM cars, whereas Ford and Chrysler still had high compression engines for 1971. But the Buick was the tops in the torque department across all of the competitive vehicles, as I mentioned. And you'll find if you drive one of these, the Buick V8 is just effortless and smooth. The Turbo Hydromatic 400, so velvety smooth, especially compared to like the Ford C6 with relatively firm shift points. The powertrains in these are flawless. And the only thing I would say about the Buick V8, if you ever have to replace a water pump, good luck. Very small bolts that often break off. That's one to bring to the mechanic shop, I would say, rather than do at home yourself, unless you want to be drilling out old broken bolts. Not fun. But overall, just a great car. And what do you think? Does that make sense when I say that this was really a transitional year for styling at Buick? There's a lot of differences, as you saw, between this 1971 Centurion and the Buicks that came before it. And I really think that this Centurion had something going, although unfortunately it did pick up a little bit in sales from the Wildcat that preceded it. It just didn't really pick up all that much. Actually, the Centurion's best year was its final year, 1973, where it sold about 44,000 units. In 1971, it only sold, I think, about 27,000 units. So not a great seller. You can imagine people going into the Buick showroom and the dealer saying, well, what do you want? Probably a few people said, I want a sporty Buick, despite the fact that Buick really did have, as I mentioned, some great sporty cars. This just did not prove all that popular, but I think it's a great car nonetheless. Put a comment in the comment section. Let me know what you think. And do you like these kind of styling expositions to go along with the descriptions of the vehicle? Thanks again for watching.